Good morning, everyone. This is Shelley Jurowitz, Executive Director of FAB Wisconsin. Thank you all for joining us today, right on the cuspice of a holiday weekend and some nice weather. So it's been a nice reprieve to what we've been experiencing here the last few days. Thank you all for joining us, and a special thank you to our members, more specifically our premium members and our select members who go above and beyond for this organization. And it's great to be working with Michael Best, in particular on this session. So thank you, Paul, for the work that you do for us and your team, Leah, behind the scenes. I want to give you just a little bit of background before we move into the program today. FAB does have a COVID page. We do feature all of our member resources on that COVID page. And if you have additional resources you think that we should add, please let us know so that we can keep that up to date. It is a beast to maintain the accuracy of what's on that site. So all the help that we can get, we very much appreciate. I just wanted to point out that we do have some additional CEO briefings that have been scheduled for June, and another session that will be just a wonderful follow-up to what you're going to be hearing today. And that session will be on June 12th. That will look inside the office, inside the plant, inside the walls of your operation as we look to go back to work and keep our businesses operational. So take a look at that. I think, again, it will be just a wonderful reinforcement and perhaps a little deeper dive into what you're going to be hearing today. What to expect today, we are going to have just a wonderful presentation. And again, thank you, Paul, for working with your folks to pull this together for us. After those presentations, we're going to open it up to Q&A for everyone. There is a Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen, and there's also a raise the hand function if you would choose to ask your question in person. Sometimes it can be difficult to type everything out, in particular as the subject matter gets more and more complex. We will remind you, I know Pat is really good at this, that when you are asked to speak, to unmute yourself. It can take us all a little off guard to find that unmute button, but it is located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And then finally, I wanted to just let everyone know that we do record these sessions, and we are making them available, as well as the PowerPoints, on our events archive page on the FAB website. So without further ado, I am pleased to pass the microphone over to Pat Werner, our Director of Food Safety. Thanks, everyone, and have a great session.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. And I just wanted to welcome Paul as well. He is one of the co-chairs on our Food Safety Forum. And Andy Winger from Malio and Scott Halverson from Denali are also on as well. But Scott and I will be, or Paul and I will be moderating this session today. The important points that we're going to make today really is focusing on the facility, employees and visitors, how you set that up, sanitation and environmental, as well as, and again, most importantly, keeping our employees safe. And without further ado, though, I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Paul, because I want to make sure that we have enough time at the end for all the questions that people will have. So go ahead, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pat, and good morning to everybody. My name's Paul Benson. I'm a partner at Michael Best. Michael Best is the law firm that advises FAB Wisconsin and has had the privilege of doing so since the very inception of the group. My role here today is to introduce three outstanding experts on the subject of food safety and food production safety. These three, I'm going to give my thanks to them right off the bat, because I know that they were emailing back and forth throughout the day yesterday. I'm sure that they'll be talking about the fact that yesterday the USDA and FDA announced a memorandum of understanding to help prevent interruptions at food facilities, and they were updating their materials throughout the day in light of the ever-changing landscape that the food and beverage industry is facing during this pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Mark Roberts. Doc Roberts and I actually go way back. Doc has been an expert for me and for our firm's clients in the past. And in both litigation and otherwise. He specializes in occupational and environmental medicine with a background in public health and epidemiology. He spent 17 years at the Oklahoma State Department of Health, followed by 9 years teaching occupational medicine and consulting with companies while on the faculty of the Medical College of Wisconsin, and has spent the last 16 years working at Exponent as a consultant to companies. Brian Harms will also be speaking today. Brian is a project manager at TRC Environmental in Brookfield, Wisconsin. TRC is an organization that provides environmental, consultative, engineering, and applied technology experience to their clients. Brian's experience specifically includes environmental compliance, industrial hygiene, work plan preparation, and a number of topics that are unique and specialized to the food and beverage industry. The last person that I will introduce is my partner, Chuck Palmer. Chuck is the sub-practice leader of our workplace safety and health group here at Michael Best. He has defended employers in more than 1,000 OSHA citation cases over the course of more than 25 years. I am proud to call Chuck my partner. He is one of my favorite people at the firm, and you will not find a better expert in the field than Chuck. So with that, I am going to pass the baton to Chuck, and Chuck will lead the way then through the rest of the presentation. Chuck?
Thanks, Paul. And Paul, the feeling is mutual. So over the last 30 years of my work in the workplace safety and health field as a lawyer, I've leaned heavily on a handful of consultants, and Mark and Brian are two of my top go-to people in that regard long before COVID. We've been in the trenches together, in some cases literally in the trenches, addressing workplace environmental hazards, lead, mercury, carbon monoxide, smoke, and gas from processes like par frying, ammonia, mold, and silica, to name a few. And so they're naturally who I turn to in the response to clients who are looking for help in the COVID-19 situation. And unbeknownst to me, for a number of years, Dr. Roberts was also a go-to expert for Paul, as he mentioned. And then also Brian's firm TRC has been working with our environmental team for decades. And so these are two experts that are very well known to me, but also very well known to other aspects of our firm and practice area. Dr. Roberts, when we first got started in this, situation, January, February, he was already on the ground in China managing temperature monitoring and things like that. And so in early March, we started fielding calls from water parks and hospitality industry. And I really thought we were the front runners in terms of dealing with COVID-19. But this thing is, it's not like that old joke, I don't have to outrun the bear, I only have to outrun you. This is more like running of the bulls in Pamplona, Spain, where a head start really doesn't help. So you can't outrun the bull here. The stuff just keeps changing. And we really are running with the bulls, trying to keep up with all the changes. And this is the real challenge, is trying to streamline this stuff into something that's understandable. You got a bunch of people in CDC that are doing a great job, well-meaning, but they just keep putting things out, and it's changing every day. And then you've got agencies like OSHA that are changing, FDA, USDA. And so trying to pull it all together into something that's cohesive is what we're trying to do for you today. So, it's a daily thing. This week, OSHA changed their regulation approach to record keeping. Last week, it was the Supreme Court decision. There's the Missouri case that involved a meat packer as to who has jurisdiction, whether companies can be sued, whether it's OSHA. As Paul mentioned, the FDA and USDA came out with their memorandum of understanding this week. We had been having weekly calls with the FDA, and I had a call this morning with the USDA, got another one this afternoon with FDA, just letting them know how things are happening here in the Heartland and what we need in terms of resources and management. So we've been pretty instrumental, our Michael Best Strategies group in DC, of getting attention to this issue that our food supply chain is at risk. If you shut some of these food manufacturers down for even 14 days, it's a challenge in the meat industry. It becomes really challenging in the agriculture harvesting and planting and detasseling corn and so forth, where you could literally lose crops and lose 52 weeks of food supply. So we're going to try to streamline this stuff a little bit for you. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark Roberts first. And, he's an expert in the public health world. He's been in this battle a long time. As Paul said, 17 years as state epidemiologist, taught this stuff at Medical College of Wisconsin. So he knows how the public health people think. And I want to kind of turn it over to Mark, and I'll start off with just a question for you, Mark. So Mark, can you tell us about COVID-19 and how this little virus works on people generally? And more importantly for the audience, specifically how it works on the brain and motor functions of the average public health officer who sees his role or her role as a guardian against community spread. Tell us from your perspective what practices food industry employers should focus on to protect employees and appease the public health enforcement agents.
Well, thank you, Chuck. That's a tall order, and I'm not sure that I completely understand the brain function sometimes of public health officials or OSHA or CDC, but I'll try. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. This is a very exciting time for me. It brings together a lot of past experiences in the public health world, obviously, but also in the occupational medicine world. But one of the things that the audience should keep in their mind from this point forward, two words: anticipation and adaptation. We're drinking from a fire hose right now of information, much of it unfiltered. I start my day at about 6:30 in the morning going through what has happened overnight in the rest of the world. There's new information, how it's evaluated and how it's quantified, qualified are very, very important today. Another thing is 6 feet. There's never been a time when a measurement has become more important than today when we talk about 6 feet. Where does that, that came from probably the TB world years ago, but we're saddled with that as a physical distancing. I try to not say social distancing because we need to connect with people, stay connected with people. But the public health aspects of this are really, really important in the fact that public health functions under a precautionary principle. That is, when in doubt, don't do it. And that's one of the things that we're running into right now in looking at the information and looking at the recommendations and requirements that are being put on industry. And so let's start with looking at the first slide is let's just lay the groundwork. The SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, two words come up. One is SARS-CoV-2, which refers to the virus. COVID-19 is actually the illness that it produces, but today in the media, these are intermixed, and it's probably easier to say COVID-19 than it is SARS-CoV-2. But anyway, this virus is an RNA virus, and there are a lot of RNA viruses that are affect our body. That we have cold symptoms as a result of coronaviruses, which COVID-2 is one of the coronaviruses. But the thing is that it's not like a bacteria. It doesn't have moving parts. It is merely a genetic code that is designed to infect a human cell, usually a human cell in this situation when we're talking about human disease. And it basically shanghais the reproductive mechanism of the cell and reproduces more viral particles. And those viral particles then cascade down to cause the infection. So no moving parts is important for us to understand in the fact that in the disinfectant inactivation process of how to attack the virus, both in the body and on surfaces. If we can go to the next slide, please. Because this is you see this picture everywhere, and the red sites on this, what it looks like is a World War II floating mine for submarines. These red spots are the spikes. These are the things that actually attach to the human cell. They attach to the cell. They then inject, if you will, the nucleic material into the cell and start that process. But these are called the spike antigens. And these are the ones that connect to that cell in the body and actually start this cascade. Now, one of the things is that the vaccine, we're hoping, will actually cover these spots and some other antigens on this virus and actually inactivate it or actually stimulate antibodies that will inactivate it. The second point being, though, is that surface contamination is not a primary means of infection of this virus. You'll hear a lot about, cleaning high contact surfaces such as elevator buttons and door handles and stair rails and that sort of thing. Again, that's the old public health approach. There's nothing inappropriate about it. It does a couple of things. It removes the virus from the surface. If it happens to be there, someone has to put it there. But second of all, it reassures the public. I stayed at a hotel a couple of nights ago in Youngstown, Ohio, and there was a lady that stood at the door, cleaning the door almost the entire time while I was standing there registering. So it gave me a measure of confidence that the hotel was taking this seriously. Next slide, please. But really, when we look at it and anticipate and adapt to what we're doing from the farm to the fork, it's really, really important. But we run into situations where we now have the 6-foot rule. How does that apply? How can we do that? How can we move workers to and from the fields in order to do the harvesting and maintain this 6-foot rule? We talk about protective equipment, about gowns, gloves, other equipment. But one of the things to keep in mind that when you hear about personal protection equipment, that is a specific designation under OSHA. Really what most people are talking about today are barrier masks, those surgical type masks, those medical type masks, or the bandanas that some people wear. We're going to talk about OSHA rules a little bit later, but it's one of those things, again, where OSHA has rules that have been in place for a long time. They're trying to adapt them to the COVID-19 era of the workplace. We're going to see different recommendations from different states, from the county level, and even from the city level as far as public health recommendations. And in the screening, you hear test, test, test. What does that mean as far as the screening? What about temperature? What about symptoms? It's important that it's become almost standard now to do temperature checks of individuals coming into the facility, or temperature checks on a daily basis if they do it from home. But it's really important. That's not the only thing to do, and that's not going to totally prevent it from coming into your facility. Next slide, please. So in the processing facilities, again, here we have the 6-foot rule. How are you going to do that? We have to adapt. We've got to figure out ways using barriers, repositioning individuals on the lines. One of the things is that the 6-foot rule was developed without consideration of the individuals wearing masks. Today, many of the most sites that I've been in, the workers are wearing masks. So if 2 workers are wearing masks, my mask protects my fellow worker, their mask protects me. And so that hasn't been taken into consideration in the 6-foot rule. I think it will be in the future. We see a lot of publicity about plants testing and finding large numbers of individuals in the plant being positive using the testing methods, but they don't talk about the community spread. And I think that this is one of the other areas that we've got to watch for as far as talking with the public health officials, is the fact of, is it happening more frequently in the plant than it is in the community? Our employees are usually representatives of that community. So is it more of a general evaluation of the community when you're also testing in the plant? I've talked about screening and temperature. Body temperature, surface temperature fluctuates from hour to hour, day to day, and from different ages and sexes. But it's one of the things that we now have grown to accustomed to screening. Right now, the no contact screening is the best. They're looking at these camera techniques for screening as well, which are very expensive right now, and I'm not sure are better as far as measuring temperature, but they're certainly faster. But one of the things is looking at, why is this happening in the workplace? Is it community spillover? Is it workplace noise? We know that the louder you talk and the faster you breathe, the more likely you are to transmit these droplets out of your mouth and into the area of surrounding area. And so one of the things that we wonder about, and it hasn't been proven yet, is in the workplace where it's noisy and people have to raise their voice in order to communicate or wear hearing protection, is that actually part of the spread in the workplace setting? Next slide, please. One of the things to consider is not only your employees, but also the people that come on site. Truck drivers, for example, are they being screened like employees? But when you start screening non-employees, contractors, we run into HR issues. Be aware of those and be careful about that, as well as the legal issues. Next slide, please. So now we get into the establishments, the restaurants, the grocery stores. Been working in each of these areas, and again, anticipation and adapting to the new rules. But keep in mind, there is absolutely no evidence at this point of the transmission of COVID virus as a result of food, either cooked or uncooked. This morning I was just reviewing, there's a new activist group discussing the fact that the meat has not been tested and certified free of COVID-19. Well, that's not going to happen, and that's not a way that it's transmitted. Certainly cleaning the surfaces, but one of the things is not overdoing it. Use the disinfectants that are appropriate for it. There's a thing called the EPA Enlist that Brian will probably mention in his presentation in just a little while. But I think the other thing is dealing with the new normal, what the community is expecting, what the community is anticipating. You've got to be careful about what is in the media today. It's not all correct, as we all know, but there certainly develops into public health issues. And then the 6-foot rule, even in the establishments. Grocery stores now have markers on the floor that indicate how close individuals can get one to the other. Next slide, please. So for the future, adapting, there's going to be a vaccine. There will be several vaccines. It will probably not be available before the 1st of next year. There will be a rush for who gets it. It's probably going to be given to the high-risk individuals, those people with underlying health conditions. First, probably healthcare workers in that same group, and then it will filter down. There will be some bumping and shoving going on as far as who gets vaccine, what states get the vaccine, what countries get the vaccine. They anticipate needing over 1 billion doses of vaccine, and so it's going to be a Herculean effort to get this vaccine out. And then we're going to see the media coverage of reactions to the vaccine, and we're going to have to anticipate that that's going to happen. It's happened with every other mass vaccination program. Testing, you hear about testing. Well, one of the things is there's none of the quick tests that are being used, and there's over 100 of them right now. None of them test specifically for live virus. They test for viral particles. It can react to a intact virus, but one of the things is we still don't know about the infectivity of an individual that is positive. But this is one of the things that we're having to wrestle with as we start these processes of including testing in our screening process, where screening right now is temperature and symptoms. So the important thing is to really align your efforts as far as the regulations and recommendations and the social norms, but keep in mind that they're going to change. And so again, anticipation and adaptation to what's coming out. Brian and I, Harms, and I have been working together for quite some time in various areas in industry, and it's really important that we keep a practical view of how we approach the COVID activities in the plant. So I would hand it over to Brian and ask him to really differentiate for me about what's happened in the past versus what's happening now, and how we might use past experience as we move forward in addressing COVID-19 issues in the plant. Brian, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Roberts. That was good. Yeah, it's one of those things where over the years as an industrial hygienist, you're going into facilities, working with facilities and OSHA, and really the focus has been on the processes and how you are going to protect your workers from exposures from the process. I guess we go to the first slide. Really now what we're really looking at is, all right, we have now the transmission source for the exposure is coming from our neighboring workers. And really the facilities have not been set up to really handle those types of exposures. Right now, facilities are set up really to handle from the processes. So this has been a complete change of thinking, and it's something that OSHA regulations are trying to catch up with. Facilities are trying to catch up with now, and that's why you're seeing all sorts of different changes going through and regulations coming out daily. So, really the focus on this is you're looking at now the people, your neighboring workers, places where you're working, and still want to function on the processes, because whatever controls and stuff you're putting in place, you want to make sure that you're not forgetting about the processes, and now you're going to create some other hazards. Next slide, please. And as Dr. Roberts was talking about, we've got primary and secondary ways of transmitting this right now. And certainly the primary way is droplets through the air. And that is what we want to focus our controls on when we were talking about getting in with some of the OSHA regulations, what OSHA is going to look for when they come on site. Secondary, some of the surfaces, some of the articles that came out this week from CDC are saying, hey, not really sure if that's coming from surfaces, but in the same article, they say, yeah, we still want you to do cleaning and disinfection. So we'll talk about that as well. Next slide, please. Just to kind of get an idea on some of the stuff where, again, it's some of the studies talking about how long this stuff can last on different surfaces. It's imprecise right now, but it kind of stresses some of the importance of, hey, let's go back and let's say clean this and kind of, be mindful of how we are setting up our stuff and all the things to look at from the boxes, chairs, desks, cups and glasses. Next slide, please. So getting into what OSHA is looking for. And on some of these slides, there's lots of information on here. I'm not going to go through all of it in that great detail, but I put a lot of links in here so that if you're looking at this in a week or two, you can go back and look at some of the sources. But this first link is a document that Chuck will be talking about as well, but it's a OSHA publication on really putting together an infectious disease preparedness and response plan. And this is something where you really want to go through and you're going to address all the OSHA hierarchy as far as going engineering controls, administrative controls, work practices, PPE, and certainly training employees and getting those policies and procedures all into a written document that you can easily communicate with your employees. And certainly if you get an inspection with your local health officials with OSHA, things to talk about and going through it. And so we'll talk about some of the existing OSHA standards. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Roberts had indicated, is that a lot of, there's not a lot of OSHA standards specific to COVID right now, and they're trying to adopt some of their existing standards to this. And what we're seeing out there that are being cited when OSHA comes on site, personal protective. So you're looking at the 1910-134 standard. The bloodborne pathogens, that doesn't specifically deal with COVID, but a lot of the framework in that regulation is stuff that you're going to want to still have and work through, and it can be useful for setting up your plan. And then HAZCOM for cleaning and disinfecting chemicals. Make sure that whatever chemicals you're using for this, that you are training your staff on how they're using them and that they're using them safely with the right PPE, because some of the stuff can be pretty nasty stuff to work with. And then the main one that we're seeing is the general duty clause, is that this is all encompassing, and that key statement that's in there, free from recognized hazards. This is what OSHA is looking at, and this is how we want to focus our plan and what we want to control. So if we go to the next slide, please. You know, right now, like I said, we were talking about processes before. Well, our recognized hazard for this is it's the worker next to us, and how are we minimizing this contact? And certainly a picture like this, you know, when they start talking about sneezing protocols and stuff, that's what we want to focus on too, is that people aren't doing this, because this is how we're wanting to look now at facilities. Next slide, please. So as we go through setting up a plan, you're really looking at, you know, this is nothing new, the hierarchy of controls. Can we eliminate the source? Engineering controls, administrative controls, and then as a last resort, if we can't make those changes, then we're looking at personal protective equipment. Next slide, please. So elimination, as Dr. Roberts was saying, a vaccine, you know, we're probably not seeing that until early of 2021, or shutting down. And that's not an option either, especially in the food industry. You know, food industry is vital. We need that. And so the elimination of the source is something that we don't have available to us right now. We can't do a product substitution or change. So we're looking at some of the other aspects. Next slide, please. So if we start getting into engineering controls, I listened to the presentation that Tracy Earls of Cargill put on a week or two ago here on one of these webinars. And that was a very thought through process of how their plant and operations, how they want to install controls, the barriers, getting people spaced, reconfiguring how things are set up. And that was a very good approach. And that's something that you're going to want to do as you go through your facility, is do we have options for putting in physical barriers? You know, some cases you can't. And also be careful that if you are putting in barriers, that it's not causing other issues as far as safety hazards. You know, reconfiguring some of the communal work areas. You're looking at those offices. One of the things that we keep seeing in offices is they're going to those open concepts where you've got 4 people sharing a cube, and you've got the barrier walls are all coming down so you can visual sight. Well, in this current environment with COVID, you know, that may not be the best option anymore. And now a lot of those sites, you may be within 6 feet. And so now you're trying to look at how can you reconfigure your office setups, or out in the facility, you know, positioning on where do we have workers standing. One of the other things to look at too is ventilation. ASHRAE has a document out there that is being referenced in some of the return to work response plans in Wisconsin and Michigan, really looking at things like zone balancing. And certainly in the food industry, you'll have areas under negative pressure because you're trying to prevent it from getting into other areas of your process, positive pressure areas. Really what you're trying to avoid is some of this, you'll see a lot of personal fan setups if you're in areas that aren't, you know, kept cold. And then you've got that horizontal airflow, and that can be transmitting from worker to worker, and those can kind of create some of those issues. So they're really looking for if you can do laminar makeup air downward as opposed to horizontal flow. You're also looking at maybe HEPA filtration. Now in this documents and stuff, you know, the medical industry really gets into some of the HEPA filters and some of the UVC. Although we do have some of our food facilities using UVC, and knock on wood, it's been pretty successful so far. But those are options, but they have air handler systems that are designed for those. If you're trying to go back and retrofit a system that wasn't necessarily designed for HEPA filters or UVC, that can be a pretty expensive undertaking and not something that is going to happen overnight. And so it's one of those things, though, if you are making changes to your ventilation system in the future, maybe you want to consider some of these options and looking at it, but certainly some of the other things with the zone balancing and how you're going to do your makeup air and exhaust, that can certainly be looked at. Humidity plays a big point too. The recommended humidity for virus control in this document, they're saying, is at about 40%. And so that's something to look at. The full link there is included in the slide for future reference on that if you want to look at that document. Next slide, please. And so administrative controls, Chuck's gonna talk about some of the I guess, non-occupational aspects, looking at, how are we getting the workers to site? Where are they staying? Especially if we get a big influx of workers and the fruit and vegetable, season's coming up here. They've got a short time frame, lots of workers coming through. How are we going to go through this? So staggering when they arrive, departure times, queues, things of that nature. Next slide, please. So we're also talking a little bit about cleaning and disinfecting. Again, this is kind of a secondary means of transmission, but it's something important to still kind of look at. And it's just good practice in in a big manner on this. Next slide, please. When looking at this slide, I'm not going to go through this full flow diagram, but there are what I'm seeing some companies wanting to do is just kind of skip a lot of the cleaning and go right into applying a disinfectant, where they will walk around with a fogging machine and do that. And I remember talking with some of my scouts, when we'd be on campouts, we would sometimes use bleach at the end of a camping trip to disinfect dishes after we cleaned them. And they would want to skip to that last step. Well, if you didn't clean your dishes first and you're just dipping it in a bleach or something, that's not very effective. And you can think about it in that same manner here, is that if you're not going through and doing the cleaning process, applying a disinfectant afterwards isn't going to be all that effective. Next slide, please. So one of the ways you can really check that is, this is something that the food industry has been doing over quite some time, is ATP testing. Is that this adenosine triphosphate is a particle that is used for energy in all living cells. So if you can remove this particle, essentially the virus needs living cells to be able to produce on. And if you can remove these, the energy cells, the virus is not going to have anywhere to stay. So a lot of times with cleaning programs, what we're seeing is that you've got a staff in there that's doing the cleaning. Well, how well are they cleaning a surface? And you can use this type of real-time monitoring to check how they're doing on the surfaces and go back and really use it to train your cleaning staff. Setting up different protocols. There are things out there like for these instruments, if you're doing high touch surfaces, if you're getting a reading of like a 36, say, well, let's go back and clean that area. And you can set up different protocols, different instruments read differently. So things to be careful of, but in the food industry, ATP testing is nothing new. Next slide, please. So again, I'm not going to touch too much on this, but this is stuff that Chuck's going to get into a little bit more with some of the non-occupational stuff, the carpooling. Next slide, please. So the PPE, last resort, if you can't get through the engineering controls, administrative controls, then you're looking at PPE. In this case, a lot of it is going to be with the face shields, or if you're in higher risk areas, respirators like the N95s. The face coverings are not considered PPE, but they're more of a best practice. Next slide. And that's something that they've been putting in with the 1910-134 OSHA guidance, is that you're really looking at the N95s and the shortage of those. They have a link here on what to do if you're having problems getting a hold of these N95 respirators. These are the other things they want you to look at. And again, in here they stress that surgical masks are not respirators and do not provide protection against a lot of procedures. So if you have a facility where you are doing processes that you need the N95s, you're following all this already. But if you're putting on the face coverings as a best practice, that is not something where you're going through and doing the medical testing, the fit testing, things of that would also be part of this. Next slide. Really what you're looking at is, this is the training that you would give your employees for wearing the face coverings and how the face coverings should be worn. So this is the type of training that you'd go through. They don't need to go through the medical clearance. They don't need to go through fit testing. And you really just want to make sure that they're wearing these face coverings correctly. And so I guess with that, Chuck, I'll pass it over to you. I guess to talk about some of the next stuff where, some of the things that just came out yesterday with the OSHA and the record keeping requirements.
Thanks, Brian. Great. Go to the first slide. So Brian talked about cleaning and a number of things that you kind of find these spread around various documents between CDC, OSHA, and then local regulation, whether it's the local public health department, the state orders. And so you're getting a lot of different sources of information focused on these. And as I said at the outset, you sort of try to streamline these. And, OSHA in March, they issued a guideline, that 3990 document, and it's up on the slide. I obviously didn't include the whole thing, but pretty generic. And it had a lot in there for healthcare. And then it had some general stuff in there for everybody else. And in essence, what they focused on is doing some kind of a risk assessment. And have you done a risk assessment? Have you done an evaluation and determined, what your risks are? And that's the first thing OSHA is going to ask for. And then, after that guidance was issued, we started having problems in the first on the beach essentially was the meat and poultry industry. And we've all seen the media on that. And so OSHA came out with a guidance for the meat and poultry industry. And they sort of used the same approach that they've used in ergonomics and in control of environmental hazards all along, which is that hierarchy that Brian talked about, is engineering controls, administrative controls, PPE, which is a fine way to do things if you've got time and you have continuous process and you've got the science. It's not very useful when you're in an emergency situation because the priority is engineering controls, but engineering controls take study, trial and error. And, by the time you get your engineering controls, we may have a vaccine by the time you perfect those things. So it's just been continuously not as helpful as you like because they're using the same techniques as the past, which is start out with engineering controls. And essentially you may be looking at air handling systems and barriers and so forth, but you're trying to use a system of devices to control things in a plant that's already designed for a different approach. And you put up barriers, you just changed your air patterns, your airflow, and you don't know what the unintended consequences are because it wasn't designed for those. So people quickly rush out and do those things. And then, the question is, are they really as effective as they could be? So what we've been trying to do in dealing with FDA and USDA is try to get more of a punch list type of guidance that's out there that people can quickly employ. And, I kind of use my top 10 when we talk about what's in these various standards and what's really the accepted practices. And those top 10 are cleaning, and I'll go back through these: cleaning, hygiene, distancing, which includes a number of things, checking for signs and symptoms, don't come to work sick policy, monitor absences, work with local health authorities, deal with travel and commuting, training of workers, and then response plans to positive test results or symptoms or exposures. And so kind of going through those, the cleaning, Doc and Brian already talked about those. They are things that are expected of you by virtue of you being in the food industry. You have to employ some of those same practices beyond just the food processing areas to offices, and it's expected, even though the science is starting to recognize that really the primary mechanism of infection is breathing zone. But we still have this cleaning set of guidelines, and I don't think that's going away. And so I think we have to deal with that cleaning, and we have to deal with it effectively. Then hygiene, which is, hand sanitizer, sinks, etc. Those kind of hygiene practices, that has to be implemented. You have to have sinks with soap available. You have to keep refilling the sanitizer, having it available. And if you don't do that, that's going to be a black mark on your record, and it's something that's expected. One of the primary things, though, is this distancing concept. And I lump in distancing, barriers, face cover, face shield into that same distancing concept. And the struggle that you get varying degrees of answers on this is it required to have 6 feet of distance and face covers, face shields, or barriers, or is it either or? And in some cases, we've had public health say, it's not an exposure if you're wearing a face covering, even though you're within 6 feet, but nobody will actually say you can relax the 6-foot rule if you're wearing face covering, but you're going to have to do one of those. And in some cases where you can't maintain the 6 feet, and let's face it, you can try to maintain the 6 feet, but the reality is that you're not going to be perfect on that. And so face coverings become effective. And then there's studies that say that face coverings are much more effective if you're wearing face shields. 96 to 97% of the viral particles don't get on the face coverings if you're wearing face shields. So to me, the face shield and face covering is the gold standard as an immediate first response, because you're covering, you're creating a barrier. The face cover protects other people. It doesn't, in theory, doesn't protect the person who's wearing it. There's no studies. It's got to provide some level of protection, but there's no studies on that. So really the face shield protects the person who's wearing the face covering from getting the viral particles on the face covering, and then the face covering and face shield provide some protection for others. So, that to me, that's the gold standard right now. Uncomfortable for workers. It's going to be worse in hot months, and so that's going to be a difficult thing to maintain. And then the next step in the process is checking for signs and symptoms. Having a policy that says, you can't come to work sick, and then checking to verify. And that may be temperature monitoring. It may be some employees using an app to verify that they don't have symptoms, doing temperature monitoring at home. The next thing is monitoring absences. Through this process, I've got a stack of notepads that's probably a foot thick right now of all the cases that I've walked through with contact tracing. And one of the things that I see happen is people are absent for a while, then they come back to work, and nobody's gatekeeping that, hey, if you're out, why are you out? Why are you coming back? And so that's an absolute a necessity that you watch for absences. And if somebody doesn't come to work one day, you need to have extra vigilance as to why they're not there. Work with local health authorities. You do not want to meet your local health department the first time when you've got a bunch of cases. Find out from them what's going on in the community, what testing is available, and make sure you make an outreach to your local health department. We did that right away in early March, talking to I'm out in Waukesha, the Waukesha Public Health, Dane County Public Health. I learned a lot of what they weren't going to be able to do, and realized that we needed to implement contact tracing at the worksite level. Travel and commuting, the 6-foot rule becomes a real challenge as to whether you can actually achieve that 6-foot rule. If you think about a school bus, that means only one row of the bus seats or staggered back and forth. So you really get just a fraction of the people in a school bus. And so the issue is, can you wear a face covering while commuting and be compliant? And so far in Wisconsin, the public health people are saying, no, we're working on that. That's part of that MOU. If you read what FDA and USDA announced, I use the term, we're asking them to be the Dutch uncle, come in and do marriage counseling with the local health departments if they're trying to shut people down because of this 6-foot rule and it's not possible to do, or they're quarantining people and shutting companies down, that they would come in and persuade related to the food supply chain. And then training in languages that are understood. There are a lot of posters out there. Utilize those things. And finally, having a response plan to positive signs and symptoms. The next slide, will be in the materials, but it's just sort of our effort early on as a flow chart for determining whether something is an exposure. You need to have something like this. It needs to be updated. The top, part of it right away, you can see is outdated because early on it was fever, cough, shortness of breath. There's a lot more symptoms that are at issue in addition to that. And then next slide, this week, 2 days ago, OSHA came out with guidance on record keeping. Early on, they had guidance that pretty much relaxed the requirement to record COVID-19 cases. Now they've thrown something out there that's very complicated, and as you read through it, your head starts to spin. I put out an alert that's being published as we speak. I'm going to send it off to Fab Wisconsin to distribute to everybody. I won't walk all the way through this, but the upshot of it is ask employees 2 questions if they have a positive test result. The first question is, where do you think you got infected? And the second question is, what else have you been doing besides going home and coming to work? To inquire whether they've had any other contacts that may have been the cause for the incident. If those questions don't give you an answer that suggests that it's not work-related, then record it on your OSHA 300 log. You can strike it out later on this year as you learn more about what happened within your workplace. But don't get all bogged down in all of this record-keeping stuff. That's a rear view look at what happened. What you really need to be focusing on is if you have a positive test, who has that person been in contact with that you don't know about that also may be infected, so that you can control in a forward-looking way. Don't look in the rearview mirror, which is what OSHA record keeping requires. Just put it on there and we can strike it out later. And I won't go through the rest of those slides on that OSHA record keeping. We could skip forward to slide number 37. So one more forward, I'm sorry. Keep going. So now, as I said, the Supreme Court ruled on the governor's order, and essentially the one issued by Secretary Palm, and voided that. And so we've got various local health and county departments issuing, accepting that old rule as their own rule, or putting in their different rules. You need to contact your public health so you know how they're addressing things. And then finally, you're going to be dealing with OSHA if you have a bunch of cases or if you have a fatality. And OSHA is conducting virtual inspections. And this is an example of virtual inspection: meat plant, fatal accidents, or fatal COVID-19 cases. And it's pretty interesting to see a virtual inspection because up until now, OSHA did inspections on site, and trying to ask questions. It's sort of like Paul will be familiar with the concept of an interrogatory, where they're asking you to tell on yourself. But this gives you kind of an idea of what they'll be looking for when they're coming in. And the first thing that I point out here is, did you perform a risk assessment? That's going to be key. And then if so, did you share it with employees? Was it implemented, and describe how? Next click, please. Were there any engineering controls in place? Click, please. Has there been any change in workplace procedures, controls, PPE, maintenance, or training since the incident? So, what have you learned? Are you fixing things? So they really are focusing on, all right, you got a problem. What are you doing moving forward? Next click, please. And, and then they're looking at interviewing coworkers. So they're doing sort of their own version of contact tracing. So you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've got a response plan in. And so really OSHA is the regulatory agency. Public health has some tools available to them. They can quarantine people, but really shutting down a plant, especially a food plant, that may result in what's happened out in the meat and poultry industry, where the FDA, USDA may come in and implement the Defense Production Act to keep a food facility open. So the regulators, other than OSHA, really don't know what their authority is, and OSHA is just finally catching up. So I'll wrap there because I know we want to have some time for questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Chuck and Doc and Brian. That was an awesome presentation, by the way. And I just wanted to follow up with a few questions that I have. If anybody has any questions, they can raise their hand, or I did get some questions that I wanted to put out there. I think you've addressed some of them. But so you were saying that you were on the phone with the FDA yesterday or yesterday. So do you see the OSHA, FDA, and USDA collaborating on the guidelines and coming up with guidances for the future?
Yes, I do. And the question is, what guidance? And I'll just be blunt. There are other food industry folks out there that have put some things out that we saw on behalf of the processors that we didn't like. Things like, saying things like, well, we'll quarantine people who've come from another state for 14 days. And we'll keep 6-foot distancing in vehicles, and things that could be what I frankly think do more harm than good. And those were put before FDA and USDA, and we've been working to pull those back because they're harmful to the ability to produce food. And frankly, I think it was well-meaning safety professionals that wanted to write guidelines that were looking at, what would be the most cautious thing to do, and frankly, could be harmful to the ability to engage in production, and therefore harmful to the food supply, which in my view is, a greater danger than some of the things that they were trying to address. So really the exercise has been in convincing FDA that we need a very specific guideline that's a punch list, and we put together exactly that punch list, and on it we indicated that these are the things we need FDA to, the practices we need FDA to intervene to stop at the local level, because they are going to affect the harvest. They're going to affect the canning, the production process, and we can't have those kind of guidelines out there. So yes, they are going to do that. Right now, the issue is making sure that they do it right, because those will end up becoming guidance that will be used by local public health departments.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like probably the way that they're going, particularly when it comes to all the regulations that they put in place with the Food Safety Modernization Act are going to be impacted as you implement, as you indicated, on the sanitary transportation and just employee GMPs, and what about supply chain? That's another thing. How do you indicate that the virus itself can come across like on cartons and things like that. So from a manufacturing standpoint, then it's also the handling of things that are coming in and that kind of thing. Is there any other information that you have on that?
I don't. That's not been that has not been a focus because of that mechanism. Transmission really primary is kind of controlling that respiratory droplet spread, and I don't know that I see a lot of focus right now being placed upon the packaging. I don't know, Doc or Brian, do you have anything different?
Chuck, this is Mark. One of the things is that there was a laboratory study where they blew virus on stainless steel, plastic, copper, and cardboard. And the virus was viable for 3 to 6 hours in most situations, but they say up to 24 hours in a few situations. So we don't think that mail, packages, that sort of thing. We addressed that from material coming from China early on. We don't think that the packaging is going to be a primary source of spread of the virus in the workplace or in the community. Certainly there's been some flap out there about, microwaving your mail and all these different things. That's just not appropriate at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Doc. So I have a couple questions more questions that have come in. How much of our procedures would you recommend we communicate with our customers, specifically retail setting, robust social media?
Yeah, that's a good question. From I think you need to have a well thought out plan. And the way we've been doing this is we've been doing these control plans. The three of us had, we call it kind of a workforce protection plan. We send Brian out, into the field and study the process. Then Doc and I kind of look through the recommendations, develop policy procedure, develop a whole control plan, and we do that under attorney-client privilege. And then once we've got it right, then that's the kind of thing we would be, proud to share, or the client company would be proud to share with their stakeholders. And so we would do that, but the point is, don't send them a half-baked cake. you know, and just say, well, we're just, you know, and frankly, a lot of times it's not going to be a finished product, but you got to get to a point where you're comfortable with it before you do that.
So it really kind of gets down to making sure that you're aware of your processes and the safety of those and how you communicate that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I have another question here. In operations with low amounts of close contact, for example, highly automated large-scale operations, would you recommend employee temperature checks? And from a risk analysis point of view, it seems that the grouping or close contact needed to perform and document temperature checks violates higher level, more effective controls like staggering shifts.
Yeah, you know, my thought process there, and Brian probably has some opinions on that too, because he's the guy that's in the field. But you know, your process when you're working is not going to put people in close contact. But there's so many other opportunities, you know, the break areas and the time clocks and the commuting situations. So you've got a lot of potential risk that, you know, bathrooms where you just can't absolutely prevent the kind of contact we're dealing with. And the temperature monitoring, I've had mixed, you know, I've had places that had 5, you know, illnesses at one time and nobody popped a positive or an elevated temperature. And then I've had others that have said, you know, we sent 20 employees away plus one USDA inspector who had a high temperature, and that USDA inspector wasn't happy, but ultimately had a high temperature. And so some of them are finding that it's effective. And, you know, so the point is that if you've got people commuting to work together and somebody's got an elevated temperature, now they've potentially infected the other person, even though in the workplace it's absolutely safe. So you still have all these collateral risks. And I think the temperature checking is an expected conduct right now. It may get relaxed, but right now I think it is a good practice. And the person doing it should be wearing an N95 respirator, should be wearing gloves, should be no touch thermometers. And, you know, so you have to have safety on that end. Brian, you have any thoughts on that, or Doc?
Yeah, I was gonna say that the facility I was at on Tuesday, we spent a lot of time really talking through the logistics of not so much where the worker was positioned, but how are they getting there? So when they do that check-in at the time clock, when they're going to the breaks, when they're going to restrooms, all the different potential routes, the staggering of how we can do that sign-in, because they have quite a bit of people all going to the same clock. And it's really a lot of logistics on trying to figure out doing this. And you're looking at bringing in different, you know, porta potties and hand clean stuff so we can start separating out into groups. And one of the things we kind of came up with on some of this was if we've got these large masses of people, that we start breaking them down into, like, say 10-person crews or so. And then that crew is kind of staying together on where they're working, how they're doing their check-ins, when they go to break, things like that. And then if somebody ends up testing positive from that crew, well, then it's that crew that you are quarantining, as opposed to the larger workforce where now you're trying to scramble to see, okay, well, who all did they come in contact with? And so, yeah, that's a big step, and that's a lot of logistics where you're trying to think through that approach.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that question sort of flashes out is, well, I got all these people standing in line to take their temperatures. I'm doing more harm than good, and that's a valid point. And right. I think you know that's part of your risk analysis, that, you know, just go through that thought process, and if you really can conclude that that's going to ultimately create more exposure than not doing it, then that's your answer. But I would cover it, and then I would knock it down as a step in my process and explain why.
Yeah, Chuck, one of the other things, though, we've had, you know, it doesn't have to be temperature at the time clock. We've had some companies that have actually done it as they came into the plant. Now, it depends. It wasn't big plants, so that may not be feasible. But again, adapting to the situation. Temperature is not the ideal. It's not the end all. But temperature and asking about symptoms, or pointing out that the symptoms through placards and that sort of thing, they're each helpful in identifying those individuals, but they're not the gold standard by any means.
Well, you know, Chuck, I know you had brought up towards the end of your presentation too about the training, and kind of going back to even what Doc had talked about with, you know, what the public and the media see. But you know, I kind of go back to the training, because if people are not aware and they don't fully understand the ramifications of the, you know, it's going to be hard for them to follow this. So training is so critical, you know, in this what we're going through right now. And I would
Absolutely, and it's a public service that you do that, because the face covering thing, you know, you get fights at stores where people are telling people, that they don't want to wear a face cover, and they don't understand that they're not being tough or brave, that they're exposing you. The face cover isn't to protect them, and so that public communication about the effectiveness of it on protecting others is important to get out there as a message.
Yeah, and I think just training the general public is really important, because I even went to the store, I don't know, a couple of days ago, and went to a Walmart, and I don't know if anybody's been there, and how they have the aisles designated that you can only go in this direction, and it's got an arrow that points like that you can only go west or you can only go east. And I'm like, does anybody read these signs that they've put up there that they can't enter because they're not going in the right direction? They don't. They go wherever they want to go.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so, you know, so even Walmart had done so much with all this signage out there, and people aren't even reading it.
Yeah.
You know, so just training the general public is crazy. But I have another question for you. Have you seen a proposed plan for a return of the FDA and USDA audits? And will the FDA do virtual audits like the USDA?
I have not. I don't know, Paul, if you have. I've not seen anything on that. We've been focused so much on the worker safety side of it, and getting FDA to sort of intervene to make sure we got good policy on that I haven't looked at that.
Yeah, this is Paul. I haven't heard anything on that other than that FDA is scrambling. So I think it's going to be a while before any of that happens. And virtual audits from the FDA, I haven't heard anything about that, at least to date.
Okay, and I think just in wrapping up here, because I don't have any other questions here, but I wanted to just comment too on the decision trees. I think that I love decision trees, you know, coming from manufacturing and food safety and quality, decision trees are great. And I think that, you know, companies that can put together those things so that when they have any occurrence, no matter what it may be, facility, employee, or sanitation, environmental, that they know what they're going to do to react to it. And it kind of was a segue into, before all of this whole crisis, Paul and I had been talking about doing a session on crisis management as it relates to food safety, the facility, and the employees. So even though we didn't get to do that because this crisis happened, but I still think that having a company put together their crisis management plan to cover all of those aspects is just really important, you know, for companies, for food manufacturers, or anybody for that matter, and retail or anything. So what I'd like to do, Paul, do you have any other comments or any other questions that you have from your group?
Well, I just wanted to ask a question of the panelists to see if they have an answer. So this is sort of your stump the panelists type question. You know, given all of the moving parts, you know, you've got FDA, you've got USDA, you've got the governor, you've got local public health authorities. Who exactly should our members be paying attention to in deciding what to implement and what best practices are?
Well, I'll let Doc start with that, and then I'll jump in after. I'm interested in hearing his comments.
Way to throw me under the bus, and that's anticipated.
You were a public health guy, because I want to hear what their authority is.
You know, I don't think there's one source right now. I think number one is an organization such as this that communicates, that shares information. I think the second thing, and it doesn't have to be it's got to be an outside source that's got their finger on the pulse. And so it's a combination of things, because honest to goodness, it's going to change on a daily, if not hourly basis. So I think it's a matter of getting, for example, I tracked WHO for a while, but the World Health Organization did not have specific enough information for us here in the U.S. So I think associations such as this, legal and public health consultants are important in this aspect. But there's not one source that I could recommend.
Yeah, and my 2 cents worth is that, for sure OSHA it has the authority to regulate workplace safety. Public health has the authority to regulate safety for the community, and the workplace sort of spills out into the community, and so they have some level of regulatory authority. They can certainly order somebody to be quarantined. Their tools in their bag are quarantine, isolate, shut down. But that shutdown is usually, a nursing home, a restaurant, a daycare center because of an outbreak, and that's protecting the public. It's not really an employee-focused regulatory scheme, so they're not quite sure exactly where they're at. And the fact is that most food businesses they have a brand to protect, and so you don't want to be in the situation like Tyson Foods was in Waterloo, Iowa, where the mayor is saying really bad things about your company because, and I don't know how much of that was, just way out there, but he seemed to be a rational person, but what he was saying just seemed extreme, and you don't want to be in that situation. That's why you want to have a relationship with your public health department and your community to try to work with them so you don't have brand damage, and you do the best you can, get good procedures, protocols together, that you can then hold up and say, we're doing all the best practices. And then if you've got a rogue public health person that is taking positions that are contrary to CDC, that don't recognize the good things you've done, that's where the FDA and USDA can come in and play your Dutch uncle. And I was trying, and I'm still trying, to get procedures that are very clear, that are a punch list of these are the things we need to do. And if we can show we're doing them, then we can come to you and you say, we're protecting the supply chain of food, and they've done all the procedures. This is outside those procedures, what you're doing at the public health level. And, and we don't want to play the DPA, but we will if we have to. You got to allow this company to continue to work. And so I think that's the goal here between the trade associations, the businesses, and FDA and USDA.
Okay, well, Paul, Chuck, Brian, and Dr. Roberts, I'd like to thank you so much for your participation on this. It's been awesome. What you've shared, I think, has been very useful. And any of the attendees, if they have questions, they can reach out to Fab, or they can reach out to the panelists with those questions. So we're going to wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it over to Shelley to just give a brief introduction into what's going to happen on our June 12th session that we have, because it really takes a bit of a deeper dive into what we've been talking about today. So Shelley, can you chime in on that?
Sure. And first I want to say thank you. The content, the intelligence that was delivered today was absolutely amazing. And I think if taken into account the CEO briefing that we had with Tracy Earls and Giacomo Faluca, and the session that we have coming up on June 12th, that starts to look at what this work environment looks like and how we interact with one another, I think it's just a wonderful three-pairing of content. And I think you've also helped us identify our upcoming sessions. Paul, I'd love to work with you and perhaps our other law firms to put together another legislative update so that you guys could share the information of the work that you're trying to do in DC, and how can FAB support in that work. I think that would be a wonderful CEO briefing. I'd love to get scheduled. And I think we do need to do another session on crisis management and mitigation planning as well. I think those would be sessions that would be really well received by our members. So thanks for not only what you delivered today, but for feeding the sessions and future briefings. Sessions and future briefings we'll be scheduling. So thank you all very much. And if there's anything that FAB can do with our membership on this line of a punch list, please let's communicate about that, because I think that's exactly what we tried to communicate in a letter to the mayor and a letter that we were crafting for the governor as well. So any way that FAB's companies can help in that effort, we'd love to be able to do that. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful holiday weekend. And again, thank you to our guest speakers today and the co-chairs of our FAB Food Safety Forum. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.